Good morning and welcome to the second session of our half-day workshop devoted to the Indian Ocean Commission and Indian Ocean security. For purposes of the recording being made, my name is Antoine Levesque. I'm a research fellow here at the IISS in London. Our earlier segment took an in-depth look at the Indian Ocean Commission, its focus, priorities and outlook in the context of maritime security. So now is the time to widen the scope of a discussion and look for lessons from the IOC to maritime security cooperation in the Indian Ocean. Our previous speaker, Mr. Mohabir, invited us to talk jointly about research and development, and what I want us to do in this session is really to bring those two perspectives together. The IISS last month published a chapter in its latest annual report on the Asia-Pacific security, looking in part at the challenges and opportunities around maritime security in the Indian Ocean. The IISS will also be publishing in the coming months an edited Adelphi book on sea lanes of communication security, including a discussion on the Indian Ocean. SLOC protection is a useful entry point into maritime security, since it brings tough questions about how to align means to address security threats by non-state and state actors at a time of sharper major power rivalry. But SLOC security, particularly its counter-piracy angle, as we heard in the first session, in the Western Indian Ocean, poses the interesting question of the role of informal government-led networks and the role for policy experimentations and even institutional innovations. The IOC in recent years, as our previous speaker made also clear, has been at the cutting edge of these exciting discussions. It is in this context that I'm particularly delighted to welcome back to the IISS Dr. Kate Sullivan de Estrada, who is an associate professor at the University of Oxford, working on international relations of South Asia. Dr. Sullivan has worked for many years on those issues, not least through a number of field work trips to the region. Dr. Sullivan, welcome back. The floor is yours.
So good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us today. Thank you to Raj for his very insightful talk earlier, on which my portion of this event will build. And of course, many thanks to Rahul and Antoine and the IISS for hosting us here today. I've had the privilege of interacting with the Indian Ocean Commission over the past 10 months. And this has been within the context of a knowledge exchange project funded by the University of Oxford. So universities across the country are now placing increasing emphasis on academic and policy exchange. And our own Oxford Policy Exchange Network kindly funded a series of interactions between Raj as the policy partner of the project and myself as the Knowledge Exchange Fellow, building in Rahul as our policy partner. So I'd like to thank all of those institutions for making these interactions possible. The purpose of the Knowledge Exchange project has been to learn from the Indian Ocean Commission's maritime security strategies, which I have to confess were somewhat vague to me at the start of the project. This is because the policy and scholarly work on the Indian Ocean Commission's initiatives is very thin. There's some in French, as my research assistant has been able to decode for me, but also because, as we've heard, what the IOC is doing is very nascent, it's emerging, and it's been very exciting to see a sort of work in progress. The other reason why what is happening in the southern portion of the Western Indian Ocean has not been perhaps publicized as much is because, of course, scholarly and policy and international attention has been focused on piracy and counter-piracy responses. So if we want to think through the maritime security cooperation initiatives of the IOC, if we want to map out the broader context, we need to think about what is happening in response to piracy, and we also need to think about the broader sort of history and I think particularly unimpressive patterns of regional cooperation in the Indian Ocean that precede some of these initiatives. So it's that context that I want to begin with, and then I want to draw out some of the lessons that we can learn from successes and initiatives of the IOC. What is the context of regional cooperation in the Indian Ocean? I mean, this is, Victoria asked us for a sort of a map. So let's draw a mental map. Let's just take a cereal bowl, turn it upside down. That's the Indian Ocean. And then jutting out of the middle like a Dorito is India. And it's really this western portion of that cereal bowl, inverted cereal bowl, that we're looking at. But if we think of the Indian Ocean as an entire region, it's an extremely huge and diverse space. So is it useful to think of it as a region at all? And if we look at one or two historical snapshots to think through the challenges of regional cooperation in the Indian Ocean, we start to get a picture of a series of great expectations and very little delivery. One historical snapshot might be the Indian Ocean Zone of Peace proposal, pushed forward by Sri Lanka in 1971, which aimed at limiting the military maritime activity of external powers in the region. This faltered. Why? Because states in and outside of the region couldn't agree on the definition of the zone, the geographical space. They also couldn't agree on any of the proposal's basic objectives. We might look at a second snapshot, and I think an interesting one is a major address by the Australian Minister for Foreign Affairs, Gareth Evans, in New Delhi in 1995. Now, why is this interesting? Well, the speech is huge. It spans several pages. But it was also a conversation between two major powers within the region. Now, Gareth Evans, in this speech at the Indian International Centre, he spoke about regional cooperation in the Indian Ocean being ripe. The time was ripe for cooperation. He was thinking more of economic cooperation. Why? Because the Cold War had just ended, because of the emergence of the global economy, and because of the economic revival of some of the regional economies. He declared, "The prospects are now better than at any time since the end of World War II for developing Indian Ocean cooperation." This was 1995, and some 25 years after that statement, we see little movement on regional cooperation within the region. We have the Indian Ocean Rim Association, the only multilateral forum established in 1997 that connects the littoral states of the Indian Ocean region, and of course not all of them, because certain key countries are excluded from that. We might see things changing, though. The 22 member states of the Indian Ocean Rim Association under India's chairmanship in 2012 to 13 enlarged their agenda from regional economic cooperation to draw on a wider scope of priority areas. And prominent among those is maritime safety and security. The Indian Ocean Rim Association, as many of you know, had a meeting of heads of state and government for the first time in 2017. They signed the Jakarta Concord, and one of the key priorities there, again, was maritime safety and security, defined as search and rescue, accidents and incidents at sea, the management of risks to shipping and marine environments, the tackling of non-traditional security threats, and the upholding of the freedom of navigation and overflight. Now, these transformations, these commitments, of course, yet to come into action. But I think what the IORA's expanding focus arguably speaks to are new sets of regional contextual dynamics in the Indian Ocean, somewhat different from the time in the mid-90s that Gareth Evans gave his speech, that have come into being and that are now pushing or creating a new incentive for cooperation within the region. The first of these, of course, is a long-term structural change. In global politics, this has resulted in the growing strategic importance of the Indian Ocean. Certainly, the economic rise of China and India, the growth and industrialization of several ASEAN economies, and we see there a growth of maritime trade, of energy and resource flows across the Indian Ocean, and more recently, very explicitly, the strategic linkage with the Pacific Ocean. And of course, along with this structural shift of strategic importance and strategic concerns comes what some see as China's challenge to the rules-based international order in the domain of international maritime law, and concern in the Indian Ocean that this could manifest as it has done in the East and South China Seas. So we have that really as one big set of changes that has drawn attention again to the Indian Ocean. The second trend has been the growth of non-traditional security threats, particularly those stemming from poverty and marginalization, so including piracy, the trafficking of humans, drugs, and arms. And it's these two shifts that might encourage a Gareth Evans of today to predict a renewed moment for regional cooperation in the Indian Ocean, and indeed that may be what we are seeing, particularly in terms of maritime security cooperation and particularly in the Western Indian Ocean. Now, we're all familiar with piracy and counter-piracy efforts. Following the sharp rise in incidents of piracy in the Somali Basin from 2005 to 2011, the region saw an upsurge in security governance. Now, this was informal, it was networked, it was overlapping, but still something quite unprecedented. Multi-naval operations, independent naval deployments, working cooperatively, and celebrated by many policy observers as reasonably egalitarian and non-hierarchical among themselves, setting new benchmarks for international military cooperation. But we need to think critically, I think, about this international response to piracy. And some of the critiques came through in a very clear way in what Raj had to say. I mean, the two issues I think that stand out for me is that first, the naval deployments in the region are not just about performing counter-piracy functions. These deployments are both symptomatic and catalytic of growing geopolitical competition in the Western Indian Ocean and in the broader Indo-Pacific. We've moved from a situation of a handful of Western ships really now to countries with bases in the region, docking rights, and certainly the northern Western Indian Ocean being one of the most militarized regions of the world. The second problem of piracy, or counter-piracy efforts, is that the issue of piracy itself has, in my view, been over-publicized to the neglect of other pressing maritime security challenges in the regions which cannot be disconnected from piracy. So since 2013, for example, if you look at the successive reports that have been submitted to the United Nations Security Council on the situation in Somalia, we see how criminal networks that originally supported piracy have turned to other forms of organized crime. Their principal organizers, financiers, and facilitators remain mostly at large, and the conditions on land that enabled the rise of piracy persist. Now, this results in two processes: ballooning, which means the shifting of maritime security to different geographical locations and different types of crime, with the expectation that the balloon can spring back. Those criminals who have directed their activities elsewhere and into other domains can return very quickly to piracy. The other process is, of course, that of what we might call polycriminality, meaning that networks of organized crime centered on piracy simply shift to other criminal activities, including, as I've noted, the trafficking of humans, drugs, arms, and also wildlife, collectively industries worth millions. So it's in the context, really, of these trends in the emergence of the Indian Ocean as one half of an emerging theatre of strategic competition. It's in the context of the increase in non-traditional maritime security threats, plus the international and regional counter-piracy interventions that have been in operation since 2008, and of course their repercussions, that we need to situate Raj's work, the work of the IOC, and their own maritime security initiatives. Now, Raj has set these out very well in the previous session, and I will echo his emphasis. But what I want to ask really is what we can learn from the IOC, from which other multilateral groupings or actors in the region with which other multilateral groupings or actors in the region can better approach maritime security cooperation. I want to focus on 8 lessons and 2 challenges. But an overarching theme that cross-cuts all of these is that the Indian Ocean Commission's initiatives are led from the region. They are designed in the region, and they are for the region, first and foremost. Now, in the regionalism literature, this has been referred to as bottom-up regionalism. And depending what definition you take, bottom-up regionalism can imply regional activities and interactions that are organized and driven by the concerns and identities of weaker states and weaker actors rather than top-down by great powers. Now, the situation of the IOC complicates this a little bit because, of course, France, through the French Department of Reunion Island, is a major power and one of the members of the IOC. And so it was very interesting for me to talk to a number of stakeholders about how they saw the role of France within the Commission. I think that we can still talk of bottom-up regionalism despite the presence of France for 2 reasons. First, because IOC decisions are made by consensus. And second, because the maritime security challenges faced by the littoral states in the Western Indian Ocean are, of course, also faced by France through its Department of Reunion Island. So I will speak of bottom-up regionalism predominantly in the sense of regionally led and regionally designed. The first lesson I think we can learn from bottom-up regionalism in the Western Indian Ocean is that a regional view of and a regional definition of maritime security problems gives us a broader conception of maritime security beyond just piracy. So maritime crime in the Indian Ocean is on the rise. The East African coast is playing an increasingly significant role in the global heroin trade. This is feeding a system of criminal governance in littoral states. And maritime security is therefore clearly a problem both of the land and the sea. Human trafficking, illegal fishing, the smuggling of weapons are growing. Climate change and the degradation of the maritime environment are key background threats. These are the issues that concern the states in the region. Now, they may be facing the region first, but they of course spill over into other regions through the growth of terrorism, the funding of terrorism, changes to refugee flows, damage to fish stocks and marine life are just some examples. So in a way, we can see the states of the southern Western Indian Ocean as canaries in the mine who are flagging up some of the maritime security challenges that will, in coming years, impact well beyond the region. So my lesson 1 is countries in the region are best placed to define what the maritime security threats actually are, beyond commercial shipping interests or the fate of international trade. Lesson 2 is that, of course, these countries are also best placed to identify the solutions to maritime security. So what the international counter-piracy response shows is that extremely costly security solutions based on the interdiction, arrest, and prosecution of a handful of pirates is not enough. And what was really interesting as I learnt about the EU-funded program to promote regional maritime security, the Marseille program that Raj spoke of, this was co-designed and co-delivered by the IOC and drew, of course, on the support of international agencies. It involved the support of Somali communities on the coast inland. It involved developing and strengthening effective and accountable prosecution pathways to give a so-called legal finish to the capture and arrest of pirates. And it also, and I think this is one of the strongest results of the Marseille programme, targeted regional money laundering networks and financial crime. So this is a much more holistic approach to tackling piracy. Now, those projects have mostly run their course and have shown varying success. But the two regional centres that Raj spoke of that come under the Indian Ocean Commission's direct control and development are a response to the local limitations of states in the region, particularly in terms of policing and patrolling their enormous EEZs. And of course, the idea, as we have heard, is that they will address the whole scope of maritime crimes, not simply piracy. It's not just the identification of solutions, but their implementation that relies on what we might call regional literacy. So what happens if you don't have regional literacy? So Raj spoke of the toys for boys. You might think that the bestowal of patrol boats as gifts to countries in the region would be welcome. One major power in particular has been bestowing such crafts. They would be more welcome, though, if, in one case, the boats were big enough to actually patrol the whole of the EEZ, and in the other case, if the country actually had a coast guard. The boats came before the coast guard in one case. So what I'm saying is that designing the solutions and their implementation should be done from the region as well. My third lesson is that bottom-up security initiatives can be effectively linked to existing agendas. Now, one of the reasons why the IOC has been able to deliver regional leadership is not just because counter-piracy efforts have gone hand in hand with the worsening of the maritime security situation, but because the IOC has been able to capitalize on the international attention that has been focused on counter-piracy in the region. So the IOC has been chairing the contact group on piracy off the coast of Somalia for the past 2 years. And what I saw at the second ministerial meeting on maritime security in Mauritius last month was a bringing together of states in the region with international players, as Raj pointed out, leading to a sensitization on both sides. First of all, you have mainland states in the Western Indian Ocean, that is the East African littoral states, that have historically not been very interested in maritime security in a wider sense, feeling part of this international agenda and becoming sensitized. But equally, major powers who were part of that meeting also became sensitized to the changing threat scenario in the region. Now, why does this matter? It matters because we see a linkage to existing agendas, which brings us to our fourth and fifth lessons. The fourth lesson is that if you link to a major agenda, you can capture what is excluded from that agenda. So bottom-up regionalism can capture what doesn't fit into that other regional initiatives, as I've underscored a couple of times now. The contact group on piracy off the coast of Somalia, for example, has resolutely refused to look beyond the mandate of UN Resolution 1851, which provides for a coordinated international response to piracy. So what does the IOC do? It can fill the vacuum by picking up, as it were, those aspects of maritime security which fall beyond the remit of the CGPCS. Again, why does this matter for Lesson 5? It's because, of course, the Indian Ocean Commission relies on outside support for funding, for technology, for certain kinds of expertise. And so if you can complement existing initiatives but also compensate for their weaknesses, this is a good way of proceeding. But one of the things that I think has been most impressive, seeing the way that the IOC views the region, is that when you're a small, reasonably weak state with limited resources, you can't afford just to be concerned with your own interests and prerogatives. You need to know what the interests of others in the region are because you need to work with them. You need to know what the interests are of major powers in the region because you don't want them to oppose you. And you also need to know what the interests of significant donors and funders are because otherwise you won't have the means to get done what you need to get done. So there's a literacy, I think, from below that extends beyond just the region and can actually capture a number of ascending levels from local, regional upwards that you perhaps cannot get in the other direction. The sixth lesson really is that porous regionalism, as it's called, pays. Now, what's porous regionalism? So this was originally a term used by regionalism scholars to describe the ways in which regional economic groupings integrate with the global economy. But we can use it to think about maritime security cooperation, because we can say, okay, here's a cluster of states cooperating on maritime security. I've got it, don't worry, I'm nearly finished. And we can see them going beyond that narrow grouping to build in other actors and other players. And I think that's precisely the view that we got from Raj, this idea of openness and inclusiveness and inviting external stakeholders in. The seventh lesson is that building on pre-existing cooperation and institutions is obviously the way to go. One small example is that several of the members of different national coast guards I spoke to in June set out how informal, although reasonably patchy, information sharing in the maritime domain was in existence between IOC countries as early as 2007. It was not holistic. There were trust issues. But that paved the way for more formal cooperation in 2009 with fisheries surveillance and multi-crew patrolling. And now, of course, we have the formal agreement under the Regional Maritime Fusion Centre in Madagascar with information sharing among 7 countries. And the fact that that is a legally binding agreement is also, I think, of some significance. My last lesson is that, of course, you need the strong institutional capacity to deliver. Now, the IOC is 35 years old. There's differing views on the value of the IOC depending on who you talk to. Some say it's a bit stagnant, it needs to be upgraded to the status of a community. Others say that, well, throughout this history, the IOC countries have built a common history and experience through these interactions. But I think what can't be denied is the IOC is seen as a competent administrator. It is now, as I've said, it has been chairing the CPGCS for the last 2 years. For the last 4 years, it's been functioning as the secretariat of the CGPCS and will continue to do so into the future. But also significant projects have been located at the IOC administratively because the IOC has a very good reputation for managing funds. So we have good, strong institutional structures. To finish off, I want to mention 2 challenges that I think the IOC faces in building regional architecture and that others could also learn from and perhaps help solve. The big problem is, of course, is getting the money, the international attention, the political will to support the IOC's initiatives. How long will international attention remain on piracy? The IOC has been able to piggyback on that. Will attention shift elsewhere, as it arguably has to some extent already with piracy off the West African coastline? So there's a constant struggle for salience. The other, I think, challenge is the question of these overlapping mandates. This is something Raj spoke to as well, the 31 overlapping initiatives in the region. Probably one of the biggest competitors to what the IOC is doing is the Djibouti Code of Conduct, also a region-led, semi-bottom-up approach to maritime security. It has a larger membership. It's recently also widened its scope beyond piracy. It arguably is perhaps less concretely taking actions in the way that the 2 centres are. But certainly this is a crowded marketplace at the moment. Going back to where I started from, I mentioned the Indian Ocean zone of peace and why it failed. Because what is the zone that we're talking about? What is a region? How do we define a region? And I think what bottom-up regionalism shows us is that regions need to be decided from below by states in the region. They need to understand what the region means for them, and it may be just a subset of the Indian Ocean, and what their core objectives are. And I think if we can have regions defined along those axes, then perhaps we can get some of the most optimal solutions for solving the challenges that the Western Indian Ocean faces. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dr. Sullivan, thank you very much. Thank you for setting the context for those recommendations and those two challenges. We now have a significant amount of time for discussion. I'd like to ask you the first question. You talked a little bit towards the end about, perhaps implicitly, of the recipients of, or the potential recipients of those lessons, which you etched out for us. Can you tell us a little bit more about who you were talking to? And particularly, do you see receptivity increasing or decreasing as a result of a greater focus, I've noted in the last 3-4 years, on major power competition versus tackling cooperatively or otherwise non-traditional security threats? And that, I think, trend has been particularly salient in the Indian Ocean.
Thanks, Antoine. So, to be honest, I think my biggest audience is both the actors and the narrators that are tied up with precisely this big power engagement with maritime security, because I think this tendency to map the world from the top down and to think about what the problems are, possibly from a different position, interested position, and to develop solutions has run its course. So I think, you know, the big sort of lesson is the methodology of, you know, how far are we actually going, and asking states what they need and what the salient issues are. Other than that, I mean, I think that there are clusters of states, for example, around the Bay of Bengal, who might share particular maritime security threats. And it's interesting that BIMSTEC, for example, has started gently pointing at some sort of maritime security related aspects that they might begin to focus on. You know, have ASEAN states who clearly have maritime security issues. So I think it's about finding communities. You know, a lot of the lessons are about, you know, things that are already in play and how we can leverage those. So I would be looking for clusters of states who already have relationships and not necessarily thinking of a blanket solution through something like, you know, the IORA, which to me seems too large and unwieldy to get that low bottom-up trust and intelligibility of the agenda and how to enact it.
Thank you. The floor is now open. I'd like to ask anyone to come forward if they have any questions they'd like to put forward. So, could you tell us who you are?
Yeah, hi. Hello, hi. Yeah, Peter Asprey again, member of the Institute. I mean, it seems sort of it's sort of an obvious point, isn't it, that when you get, you know, the two big powers, top-down big powers squaring off, that they lose. The best will in the world, they probably don't have the capability to see the smaller stuff. Easy for that to get lost, and therefore, and easy for them to play with the smaller nations without thinking too much about the consequences of that down the road. So then the challenge maybe seems to be how to get the big elephants in the room involved in a sort of constructive way without making things worse, unwittingly making things worse at the local level. And so I wonder whether, sort of looking forward, you know, there's a lot of focus on giving rights and equality to the small players and everything, but I wonder whether there is scope going forward for the smaller players to recognise that in order to have their voice heard, they need to allow the bigger nations to come in more. They need to cede more local sovereignty on the ground to bigger players who who in the course, through that process and in the course of their bigger agendas, have the resources to provide almost as afterthought the skills and the stuff that the locals need to achieve their own dreams. So it's a sort of a counterintuitive approach to a sort of a multipolar world, really. But actually, for multipolar to succeed, the smaller players have to respect the fact that big players are big, and that size demands respect, and so on, and that maybe there is they need to back off a little bit, allow bigger players more sovereignty inside their own country in order to move forward. Thank you.
I'm sure that Raj will have something to say on this, so I shall hand. No, but I think I just to challenge you theoretically rather than before Raj does empirically. There's a game theoretical model of the tiger, the lion, and the fox, and I think the idea is that the fox can leverage the tiger and the lion against one another, and I think we're in a really interesting moment of flux of who actually has the cards in the Indian Ocean at the moment. Now you can say, well, the United States is the dominant player, but actually it's very hard to identify who has influence where at this precise time. And this is a really, I think, critical window for small states in the region to actually push their agendas, because they have this this moment where they can get the best deal. And I think if you think of what India is pushing right now, it's under the first and now second Modi governments, the key catchphrase is security and growth for all in the region. Now, why are they pushing that? Because it's pushing a form of transparent and inclusive politics of cooperation between India and regional states. Now, why are they pushing it in that way? Because one of the central challenges, possibly one of the only challenges that India has, because its naval capacity is sort of tails behind China's, is this kind of battle for hearts and minds in the region. So you have, I think, a unique window where you've got major powers jostling for influence. You want to have a better narrative to persuade small island states who are strategically quite pivotal. We've seen the way that China and India are courting Mauritius, courting Seychelles, courting Sri Lanka, the Maldives. They're pivotal, and I'm not sure it's settled. And I think there's an aspect of empowerment from below there. The other issue, of course, is that I think these states have such a long history of giving respect to big powers. It's nothing new. So the question is not, can you come to terms with the dominance of great powers in the region? The question is, how do you align your agenda so that it maps onto theirs and serves theirs? And that's, I think, what I was trying to get at in part of what I was saying. But it's a valid point. You can't ignore power politics, but maybe you can play with it a bit. Raj.
Your question is very well put. And I can tell you I can't respond adequately to the question raised. But one thing I can tell you is that the status quo will change. I can't tell you whether it will change for the better or for the worse, but there will be a new equilibrium. Right now, we are saying, let's have, Kate mentioned it, let's have several of the big players with us. So who would like to come? There's no boundaries, no criteria to say, okay, X or Y. But then we know very well, for example, when you're looking at fisheries, the big players do get their way where they want to. And this is a reality. So how far the process will be able to change the status quo to one which is at least a little better. That's the challenge. And what we believe is and I think that whatever we'll be doing for the next 2-3 years will be very determining on where we would go. And this is where it's very important for us to already set the game and the process relatively already worked out. Like I mentioned, if we have a system where we are seeing some vessels doing funny things, and those will be visible to many. Get in the process, you'll know. It has to change the game. And not that just, and you're right, there is one dimension in your question you didn't ask. The problem with the big players is that the big players play individually the small ones. They won't be able to play if the way we're trying to construe the system works that way. So yes, it's a real challenge.
If I may just come back briefly, I think one of the exciting things about what you're saying and the experience you're talking about is that you seem to be a living example of a local infrastructure that has been able to organise itself quite and leverage itself, and therefore provide that kind of sort of counterpoint to the sort of the big power standoffs and space where people can think and pause and reach for their sort of more generous and wider perspective selves. So I think that's very exciting listening to you guys talk. Thank you.
The dossier the IISS brought out last month ended on this notion that the smaller countries in the region in the analysis do have a lot more agency than they used to, and they are keen to use it. We also really made clear that there was a watershed moment currently which could indeed tip things into a change of status quo, which could really be open to a number of outcomes yet to be decided. I want to come back to what Dr. Sullivan said about India. I wonder whether you, and you're obviously an expert on South Asia with a lot of understanding of India in particular. I wonder if you could tell us something about the willingness, the interest you may have encountered in India in taking some of those lessons on board, and whether you think India, more generally, has any incentive on taking these on, because as you implied in your comments just a minute ago, India is actually quite comfortable with its own approach. It has its sights set on the saga concept. And does it really need to make a change to that concept in light of those lessons? And can it really do so institutionally?
So, I mean, I don't want to speak for, the MEA or the PMO, and also speak for, Raj, who's probably experienced this firsthand in policy terms. But I think if I were to give policy advice,
as an academic,
an academic, of course, an independent academic, I think I would be, advocating a continuation of this values and identity-based projection, because, as I mentioned before, the naval component of India's maritime projection can't compare with other major powers in the region. We know that other options, such as the formation of alliances, are hugely challenging. That's why the Quad hasn't exactly taken off or been publicised, because of the fear of provoking China. So what do you have left? And what you have left is a modus operandi. And I think at this precise moment, and given the history of the region and the historical experience of small powers, the modus operandi does need to be more inclusive, egalitarian, and transparent, particularly because much of what China is doing in the region in terms of its investment diplomacy is apparently not that. And if I were India, I'd be wanting to leverage the poor reputation of China to sort of sell my own value added as an actor in the region. whether that then translates on the ground into actually egalitarian relations is another matter, and my sense is that it doesn't. That there is still a tendency to sermonize, to prescribe in much the same way as any other major power. And it's precisely for this reason that I became interested in the Southwest Indian Ocean, because for all of the history of India, of defining itself as an oppressed country that struggled with hierarchy in international politics, what we see India doing, it's long been doing it in its region, as anyone based in Pakistan will know intimately well, but now perhaps it's also reproducing those same kinds of hegemonic practices now in the region. So there are various choices open, and there's only one I can recommend. Beyond that, I won't say any more. But Raj, you might have some reflections. Yes. I don't know. You might not want to make any reflections, but
I'm not the SG of the IOC, and there's a limit to certain things that I can say or should say. But I'm torn between getting things to be, in this fora, and keeping myself. I think that for the time being, I don't see the major players really. I think that they are just waiting and see. I think but there is interest. There is interest. Russia wants to become member observer of the IOC. Japan wants to become member observer of the IOC, etc., etc. Sri Lanka has already submitted officially candidate to become a member, and if not, then become. So there are lots of interests expressed in a way or the other. And what I would, but in terms of the process specifically on maritime security, I think that, and Kate has explained very well, that what we did, in fact, is that we seized the opportunity, and we've been much more, what's the word, we've been following the work under the contact group, and we have been more like looking at how things are going, and then try to capitalize on the positions of each and the other. And this is what we are trying to do. So in fact, we've learned much from the contact group. But then how far now, because on the contact group, we know very well where each parties are. We are seeing much interest with respect to the regional architecture for maritime security that we are building. Yet we've seen many interest parties, countries, US, China, Japan, Russia, etc., all going to do visits to the centers, discussing with countries, soliciting interventions and trying to discuss with IOC, for example, Australia and the others. So there is lots and lots of interest being expressed. But what does it mean in terms of the dialogue, and how far we can say that, yes, the players will have already set the agenda on how we will, it's not yet done. I think that, I believe that everyone is waiting for the other, and the agenda is not yet set by anyone, whether it's India or China or the others.
Thank you. I have three questions on my list. The first is to our colleague Rahul Chaudhary.
Thank you. I wanted to explore further the relationship between the IORA and the IOC. I think we've heard the IOC being described as a functioning institution. Dr. Sullivan talked about the IORA as large and unwieldy. The two specific questions in this, first is, what is the perception of the IOC towards the IORA? And the second is, what are the areas of cooperation that takes place between these two organizations, and how can it best be improved or better coordinated on maritime security?
Thank you. Dr. Sullivan?
I think that that's a question for Raj, except that I did speak to a few people about this, and what I do understand is the IORA is seeking to become an observer member of the IOC. At least that's one account I heard. But you're much better positioned to answer this one, Raj.
Again, I'm struggling between being very diplomatic and in my role, and it dates back in 2013 when Australia was the chair of IORA, and Australia was very strong proponent for bringing IOC and IORA together, and we even had a minister at that time of Australia who was in charge for cooperation between the region, the Western Indian Ocean region, and Australia. But fortunately, apparently, I understood that that particular portfolio was eventually, after the elections, was removed. At that time, we in fact had this opportunity of looking at reciprocal relationship within IORA and IOC. And there were exchange of formal letters, and I was in charge for looking at that. And there is already a decision by the IORA that the IOC can have a observer status within IORA, provide the same is provided by the IOC. And then this change happened, and you know, as you know, every year there is a change of the chair. I even went, following that, I even went to the IORA Secretariat, which is based again in Mauritius, and I prepared a table of all our activities, listed what we intend to do and what objective we intend to reach in each of the activities, including, for example, even like maritime transport, improving maritime connectivity, etc., even internet connectivity, digital connectivity, all these things are in the agenda of the IOC, and we hadn't done. And then I waited, and I'm still waiting 6 years after feedback from IORA. So that's what I can say. So now, if you're asking me now what type of cooperation we can undertake, it all depends on. I mean, I may be loving that lady very much, but it's on my side. But the girl doesn't love me, or maybe she loves me, but she doesn't want to go with me. So I don't know. In Australia and Mauritius still is pushing for some sort of working relationship to be developed. Since the beginning of this year, I had at least 2 meetings organized by the High Commission of Australia in Mauritius, and I participated on those meetings in the presence of IORA officials, and I said this is what we are doing, and we wish to see how we can work together collectively. My take is that, and if you want me to be maybe brutal and very open, is that IORA maybe is too big. And I wonder whether you can take some concrete specific action and believe that you can get the adherence of all the members of IORA and then push forward together. Now, having said that, maybe, and to come to your second question, and maybe a way out would be that, for example, okay, let's look at the architecture for maritime security in the IOC region, in the Western Indian Ocean region. Okay, then we are looking at this particular region, which is a small region, and the Indian Ocean is, we're talking about 70 million square kilometers of the ocean. So maybe we will remain focused on this region. Though the cooperation that will have to be established is with the centers in the region and any center in the whole world. But then there are quite a number of other aspects of maritime security which would require activities to be undertaken in the Western Indian Ocean or in the middle of Indian Ocean. And then we can say, okay, we can work together. I said in my conclusion that we would need to have a champion. for the timing, there is no one championing, can say that, okay, this ocean we want to 1, 2, 3, 4. No one is saying that. And if IURA, I think it would have been the IURA's role to say, okay, we are covering the whole of this ocean. Well, let's be the champion. And let's put on the table some concrete actions. I don't know whether you can take about pollution, you can take measures about transport of oil, or you can take, I don't know, I can't decide for them, but you can. But for the timing, for us, it's, yet let's establish some structure for cooperation for maritime security. Eventually, and I am saying that, and I've said that in several occasions, we are very open to see how we can work with anyone, including Iran.
Could I ask a follow-up on this? The Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, which is best known for its gathering of naval chiefs of the region, its membership also includes 3 established members of the Indian Ocean Commission, Mauritius, Seychelles, and France. Is there any scope for any official lines of work between the 2 organizations?
You mean
on maritime security?
Yeah, of course it is. Of course it is. But just to be focusing on the other component, there is one component of the architecture of maritime security, which is how we can exchange information amongst the countries and with international institutions and with countries outside the region. Another agreement and structure, the center is about, well, how do we coordinate in looking specifically at which vessel is doing what, or whatever activities is being undertaken in the sea. In there can be, but for the time being, we are still in an embryonic stage of developing that mechanism for cooperation amongst the countries. Though in concrete terms, there is already much more in terms of information sharing, less in terms of how we can exchange how we can collaborate. For example, saying, okay, this vessel, which is a Coast Guard of Mauritius, is now entering the EEZ of Seychelles, and hence, do we or can we still go and check that particular vessel? We are close by there. We've started doing it for fisheries surveillance. This is done already, but there are some formula where we're working in, so that when we are crossing the EZ from one to the other, but beforehand we already include inspector from the other country there. So then the inspection is done by the other countries, Coast Guard or Navy, whatever. So there are some, I would say, established, but then it is still on fisheries surveillance. It has not yet been transposed into the maritime security use. But yes, definitely that can help to promote, or to rather push a bit further or go a bit faster in getting that component of really concrete inspections at sea to be done collectively by the countries.
Thank you. The next person on my list is John Elliott.
John Elliott, as I said earlier, been in India as a journalist for many years. I just wanted to throw in the fact that before I asked the question in the first session, I Googled India, Commonwealth, Security, Ocean, and the first story that came up was India set to guarantee key role of security guarantor, India set to play key role of security guarantor in Indian Ocean region, says the Maldives Defence Forces chief. I guess that may say more about the Maldives than it does about India as capacity. And I wanted to pick up your 2 words of sermonize and prescribe, which doesn't exactly, I suppose, go along with hearts and minds. And is that the problem, why everybody is being so sensitive on the platform today about talking about India's role?
Was this directed to Kate?
That may be more a comment than a question. It was a tease, but let's see where we get.
Kate.
Yeah, I mean, I don't need to be perhaps that careful unless, well, let's not go into what potential repercussions could be. I think
the MEA might be more open than the PMO.
You know, I think there's talk about what India wants to project, in the region, and then there's practice on the ground. And the practice on the ground might also be intended to be inclusive and egalitarian, but perhaps there are structural reasons why it isn't. So, for example, the number 1 and the number 2 in the Mauritian Coast Guard are from the Indian Navy, or is it the Indian Navy or the Indian Coast Guard? But they're Indian. The National Security Advisor in Mauritius is Indian. So there are obvious influences that India has on what Mauritius is doing in terms of its own maritime security. And, you know, I guess the difficulty always is, how do you justify shifting your agenda to meet the requirements and the ambitions of smaller states? And there are a few justifications you can use. I mean, either the smaller state aligns, as I've said, their interests with yours, or you're at a moment where you want a particular kind of leverage in a moment where power structures are in flux. So really going back to the same 2 points. So I think in any case, the country with the most influence in the region will be the country with the most regional literacy, probably, notwithstanding prior existing connected histories and patterns of interaction, such as the very strong links that, say, Mauritius and India have on the naval front and on the the security front more generally. So I think it's just really hard to make any blanket statement about it, and that's precisely why I'm interested in not just in this region but in several positions around the Indian Ocean to hear what people have to say about who's in charge, who has influence, who's an attractive partner. I mean, one of the really interesting stories I heard was, China might have money, but we don't want to emulate China. We don't see China as a sort of model to follow. And so that tells you an interesting story as well. But I think I wouldn't want to speak without really doing the groundwork of listening. And probably, if India and China want to have influence, they should do the same.
Mr. Moravia?
All depends on what we're talking about. When talking about India, if I in my whole career at the IOC is 18 years, if I take all the reports that I've seen on funny things being done in the oceans, I don't see India as the major player. I don't see India as the major player. I think there are several other players, the countries doing several other things. I would say, again, the point is I'm making that what exactly we are referring to when we are saying, okay, we have to look at India as the player. In terms of what? In terms of, because I'm focused on maritime security. So is India a major player in terms of improving or related to activities that are done? Not necessarily, no. As I said, when I was in anemic, I saw some things, and it came to me that there are other things that we have to look at, focus on. So I think that there is one aspect is the relationship that India has with several countries in terms of its policies with respect to, and whether that translates into it being the biggest player in the region or it's different. So I think we have to be very clear what we're talking about, and then we can try to dwell into more details about that particular point we are dealing with.
Thank you. The next person on my list is Desmond Bowen.
Desmond Bowen, I'm a associate fellow here. I just like to go back to this business of leveraging other people's agendas. I think that's an interesting idea. I'm conscious that when piracy arose in the early 2000s, set to in a chunk of ocean which is probably not quite 17 million square kilometres that they were actually patrolling, but in a completely unpatrollable kind of area, even with decent intelligence. And very rapidly, and I can say this from when I was on the inside of government, Navy said, this is a ridiculous exercise. The problem is actually on land. It's political and social. And I think the EU were absolutely in the fore of saying, well, we need to kind of try to get Somalia back on its feet and enable it to, create the right sort of conditions so that people don't have to go off and be pirates. So, that was maybe something where the IOC wasn't kind of leveraging the NATO or the European Union, but nonetheless the interests were coinciding. And I suppose that this puts me in mind of a question as to whether or not the IOC ought to be thinking about trying to set development priorities for rich countries, helping those in the region to solve some of the problems, because otherwise the IOC ends up doing stuff which is kind of policeman's work, checking on ships carrying rosewood, for example. Well, the problem is not the carrying of rosewood, the problem is the chopping down of rosewood in the first place. So, there's an argument for saying that actually going further up the chain, further back up the chain, to try to deal with some of these issues before they become questions of, as it were, transportation and slavery being discovered at sea, or arms trafficking, or whatever it may be. The real problem lies on land somewhere. So, the question is about whether actually there's thought being given to how it is you deploy or encourage rich nations, or not so rich nations, to spend their development money, and what those priorities would be. And the second sort of part of that question really is about the extent to which, and I think there's a difference between this as well as policeman's role and resources. Fish and mining and that kind of thing, are very particular things, relate to EEZs, but more generally even on in the high seas. Whether actually there's thought being given to what the priorities ought to be in terms of resources, the management of resources, and the policing, I suppose, of EEZs. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Dr. Sullivan?
Yeah, no, Des, you make really good points. Only so much I can cover in the talk, but of course, if you think about maritime security in the most holistic way, you're talking about livelihoods, you're talking about employment, you're talking about political stability, you're talking about accountable governance, you're talking about supporting economic growth. You're talking about effective and timely disaster response if we think about recent events in Mozambique. I agree that would be the place to start. It doesn't quite fit under the sexy topic of maritime security, though, does it, in the way that we conceive of the term? And that's one of the fundamental problems of defining security more generally. I think development money could be incredibly well spent, but we all know that development budgets are much, much smaller than security budgets. If you could just siphon off some of the proportion of the billions of dollars that are spent on counter-piracy activities into precisely the directions that you've pointed to, then we would, as you say, nip these issues in the bud. But that doesn't happen, and we need to sort of, I think, ask ourselves, this institution as one of the sort of agenda setters in what the definition of security is, has an important role to play in this. So we need to be having different conversations, I think, about what security means and how to ensure it. Whose security are we talking about? And then perhaps development budgets might flow in different directions and larger flows. I will pass over though to Raj for the EEZ question, which is also a very good one.
No, I'll go on both.
Yeah, please.
Very excellent questions. I agree fully with you. But you see, and that's exactly the response I gave to my boss, who was Seychelles in 2009, mentioned, why should IOC be involved in an area where even the UN, all the, big countries, all the big navies are not able to do anything. Why should we invest in there? Though I think differently today. But then I think the IOC get into this business for reasons such as, and again I raise that question, how come that none of the kingpins were prosecuted? Why? So if this is not being done, then, like my boss says, the Seychelles says, we have to do something. So we engaged in this business without us really willingly doing it, because the real actions were not done. Now, let me tell you that maritime security is one of my 20 dossiers on different things. One of my 20, so it's not the. And in terms of resources, it's a bit the same. Yes, indeed, we have been looking at development projects, etc., not focusing on that one. But today we have this agenda which is focused on maritime security. That's why we're talking about maritime security. But I fully agree with you, there should be other. And this is the question. In fact, when I mentioned about 2010, we formulated a strategy for maritime security in 2010. The first plank was precisely to look at the root causes of piracy. But because at that time, 2010, we were still on piracy, not maritime security. And that was, well, let's look at the root causes. And in fact, in the project that we developed just after 2013 with EU funding, the first plank was look at alternative livelihoods in Somalia, and it is being implemented by FAO. So yes, I fully endorse your point. But then again, and I'm reinforcing here what Kate said. The World Bank says that the international community is spending $2 to $3 billion per year just for curbing down piracy per year. These same members of the contact group in meetings, when we said, okay, we have this trust fund for the managed by the UN to implement activities for the benefit of seafarers, for doing this, for prosecution, for blah, blah, blah. I'm telling you, the UN is struggling since 2 years to get $2 million to get these things done. Now you tell me, well, is it IOC pushing this agenda, or is this agenda really being put on the table by who? See, that's the thing. Exactly. And this is where the reality is. Countries, and if I'm not mistaken, it was only Norway and South Korea that says, okay, we are pledging to provide some funds, and we're not talking about millions. So we can spend billions on arms. Can someone tell me how come in Yemen there is so much of, but just not in Yemen, in all the countries there is lots of arms. This issue of, because of piracy, the vessels can have armed guards, but you know that there is a provision whereby when you enter to the port of some particular countries, you have to inform, and then you have to give the arms, but the Coast Guard or navies will keep it for you, and when you are leaving, so the arms are taken well before you come to the port, and when you left, the arms are returned to you by the authorities of the particular countries. I'm telling you, there are lots of trade on that going on. And some countries are raising this. So just to tell you that these things are to a large extent, the agenda that we're setting, the development agendas and other things are set, unfortunately, not because we want it that way, but it's because we are. Now, in terms of the next question, priority on management of resources of the EEZ, this is exactly an area where we're trying to very hard find some resources to have so that we can do that stock taking of what is in the oceans. These are very expensive exercises. I saw once, because blue economy, development of blue economy is also one of my dossiers. I once went and I saw just how you go and you assess a particular resource under the sea. One experiment lasting for something like 1 week or two, maybe costing you 5,000 to 10,000 pounds. Which particular country has that amount of resources to do that? Not forgetting that all the countries in the Western Indian Ocean region, and that's why it is very important for us to look at how we can promote research and development. Research is not part of the formal government, even institutional setup of the countries. If they do research, it's small ad hoc research, most of which, the reports of which go in the drawer and it remains there. And yes, it is in the agenda of looking at what are the resources that are on the table. For example, in fisheries, we know, and I mentioned you about the issue of fisheries. We know the stock of the fish. In fact, I was in charge for the program for the biggest tuna tagging program in the whole world ever done. We tagged something like 167,000 tunas that provided enough evidence to understand what would be the stock of the different type of tuna that have been caught out of the 14 existing in the Western Indian Ocean. And based on that, we've developed a model to see which tuna we can catch how many. Now that is being used, and we know that amount. And based on that, we did that study. And this is where I was saying that even tuna fisheries, the oldest, not the oldest, it's the second oldest activity. Even on this, it's not the countries of the region which are making the most of the benefit. More than 90% of the benefit accrues to countries outside the region. So this is the reality where we are.
Can I
Please.
just a couple of just interjections? Recommended reading on this question of the money that goes into counter-piracy. There's a fantastic article, it's a bit dated now, by Sam Bateman called The Inconvenient Truth About Piracy, where he does the calculation of how much is spent on counter-piracy compared to the actual losses that would be sustained by various companies in the absence of counter-piracy efforts. And the balance is, well, startling. I won't ruin the surprise for you. Another just quick point. So as we wrap up the session, Shahrazad has some cards that I wonder if we could pass out. The purpose of them, this is sort of University of Oxford trying to understand the impact that these kinds of interactions have on their audiences. So the cards ask you, if you're willing to fill them out, you don't have to put your name on them, just to mention any key takeaways that you might take from this session, and anything that you think we should have covered but didn't. If you don't want to put your name, that's fine. If you do, that's great. And you don't have to fill it out at all, but if you do, we'd be enormously grateful. So I'll just pass back to Antoine. Thanks.
Thank you. And feedback is important. I just want to, before I get to the last question from the floor, I'd like to just follow up on Mr. Mohabe's point around funding. You mentioned earlier that there was a plan, a resourced plan up until 2023, too. We also heard from our colleague that, and indeed from yourselves, that there is a rationale for having a broader agenda or a broader understanding of maritime security. How are these two things coming together? You mentioned a plan. It would be necessary for institution building, something Dr. Sullivan referred to also in her lessons. It would be necessary to have a 10 to 15 year plan. I mean, how is that circle squared? Do you have any sense of how the organization will want to tackle that really crucial question? Because it ties in not just intent, but capability to deliver not just new things, but what is currently being delivered in a sustainable fashion.
To respond to that, I mean, I'm not responding to that. I'm trying to evade your question. But I have to give a response, so I'll give. I like very much, the response that Mahatma Gandhi gave to a journalist when he was asked, you're serious? You don't have any transport, you have nothing, and you are 600 kilometers or miles from the sea, and you want to produce salt. So he said, I know exactly where I want to go. Every single step brings me closer to my objective, and this is what we are doing. We have a plan until June, to be very precise, 12th June 2022. And what we want to do is that until then, we want to set the agenda in a way that we can't go back, that it will be sustained, and that all the actors that are concerned until then will have no option than to reinforce the process. So the broader agenda will come, and I think that, and this is very important, I think that we are in a very crucial stage now, where the seeds for the sustainable minimum regional maritime capability is being sown. So we have to ensure that by June, the seed has already started, becoming the plant. We are very clear what exactly we'll do. The agenda is set for this to be done. And this is where it is very important for us now to get the international community and agencies like the University of Oxford, IISS, and others to be our, I'm not saying to be our mouthpiece of what we are doing, but to be confronting us with whatever we are doing to help us, and collectively we can move so that this agenda setting until June 2022 is done in a way that there is no going back.
Thank you. That was a very clear answer. My last question from the floor for this session is from Dr. Adil Sultan from Pakistan. So.
Thank you, Adil Sultan from King's College, of course from Pakistan. Sorry if I am repeating some of the observations that might have been raised in the previous session. My apologies for that. Just a small comment and a question. Dr. Kate, that you mentioned this bottom-up approach of regionalization. Is it not in direct conflict with the top-down approach, especially once India is encouraging outside actors or the great powers to help build India's potential to stand up against China? So there is inherent conflict or imminent conflict between the two. The question is, do you think India's approach has some relevance to its NAM strategy of 50s and 60s, the Nehruvian approach, where India wanted to emerge as a third pole, a player that can influence the decisions of the other major powers, and likewise it's doing the same thing in the Indian Ocean region. So are there any similarities? And finally, about your interesting comment about game theory, the fox and the lion and the tiger. I can identify a panda, but whom you would identify the fox? Is it the United States or India?
Thank you. We have 6 minutes to the end of our time, so I suggest up to 3 minutes each. Thank you. Dr. Sullivan?
Thanks, Adil. Good questions, as always. Look, I don't think that there is no conflict between major powers. I think it's precisely getting back to the last question, how small states use their agency. I think that there is a way of setting agendas that, as I said, piggyback on major power interests to a certain extent, or can at least leverage major power competition in perhaps a more constructive way. So I think that we are used to seeing major power competition as a sort of a given, but I don't know if the world looks like that everywhere. So I think just encourage us to think about whether there are certain strategic positions that afford a different viewpoint and a different way of managing that. Maybe Raj has something to say on that. On the NAM, the NAM again, let me explain what I meant by the lion, the tiger, and the fox. So the lion, the tiger, and the fox, the first time I encountered this metaphor was precisely in thinking about the way that India leveraged the two sides in the Cold War. So the fox is the clever, small creature that can leverage the two big, powerful beasts who are coming at one another. And what it means is that the fox can achieve more from either of those relationships, of course, than it could if those relationships were in isolation. So I was thinking of, the IOC or the small island states precisely as the foxes that are able to play major actors off against one another. And that's not too dissimilar from the theories of extroversion that African studies scholars use to think about how various African countries leverage offers of aid and assistance from various major players to get the terms and conditions that suit them best. And there are all sorts of models of small state agency that I think we need to be attentive to when looking at this region. So that sort of fills out your last question. The one I've missed is the middle one, the non-aligned movement. For all of this posturing about India having brand new policies, of course its Indian Ocean policy builds on a long legacy, and Rahul is the best person to comment on this. What I think has been interesting in the new discourse that's coming out from from Indian foreign policy makers at this moment is building on the shared colonial legacy in the region, the idea of the region as English-speaking, not Chinese-speaking, building on the idea of shared institutions, liberal institutions based on the rule of law, again as part of this broader strategy of trying to present a kind of natural regional coherence centered around, effectively centered around India, but certainly a mutual intelligibility of countries in a way that implicitly excludes China. So I think the legacy of NAM comes into play in terms of building on that shared heritage and those shared values. I think it's definitely, it's there as a strategic resource. I can't say whether it's there as a genuine commitment, but certainly it's being used strategically. Thanks for the great questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mohaber, for the last word.
And I'd like to put much emphasis on what I will say. The architecture for maritime security that we are developing, we haven't, and I'm very frank on this because I am the one who have developed it and who are pushing it. It hasn't been developed on the basis of the geopolitical reality in the region. We are trying to keep it separate, and neither we are trying to view the architecture for maritime security in the context of a power competition amongst the nations. Though we are aware that they exist, and what exactly we are saying is that this is what we have to do. Now, Pakistan, get interested, come in the centers, start discussing with the countries. Now, as I said earlier, I don't know whether you are here, we, Indian Ocean Commission, we are an intergovernmental organization of the 5 island states in the Western Indian Ocean region. Our role initially was to spearhead and lead the process. Until the 7 countries have signed the agreements, our role now is rather to be supportive of the 7 countries having already signed. So it means then that we will now be not really be led fully, because collective thinking of the 7 countries on where we should be heading towards, on the establishment of the architecture for maritime security, etc. This collective thinking will still be done by those, even if we are now in a supporting role as a secretariat for the signatory countries. And I'm making the difference very clearly between the IOC as an intergovernmental organization and IOC as a secretariat supporting those countries which have signed, and other countries can sign together with other countries, support them to establish the maritime security architecture in the region.
Thank you. And with those words, we end precisely on time. To me, it's been a really fascinating discussion, which truly conformed to the spirit of the project we are currently working towards with Oxford University. This is a conversation around academic constructs and ideas, but with very practical policy implications. And I think we spanned the whole continuum of those questions in a way which I think also did justice to the emerging quality of those issues which a lot of us in the room, I think, were not aware of to the extent we are now when we initially came into this room. So I do hope you'll be able to come and join us again in further conversation, future conversations about those issues, not just in the Western Indian Ocean, but also in the broader Indian Ocean region. And with this, I'd like to just close requesting your expression of thanks for our panelists, and indeed thank you to you all for having set some very good questions to us, and for our panelists for having answered in such candid fashion, both of them. Thank you.